On the evening of December 13th, 2021, at a small lounge in the heart of downtown Orlando, Florida, the quiet atmosphere of the early week was suddenly interrupted by the alarming call of the bar owner. A woman, after being banned previously, had returned as though the place was her second home. This time, she not only quietly sat in a corner but also made herself comfortable by reclining on the sofa, causing several patrons to furrow their brows in displeasure. The owner, a grizzled man with gray hair and a tired expression in his eyes, stood behind the bar, unable to hide his frustration as he pointed toward the woman, who was fast asleep on the sofa. The woman, small in stature with messy, unkempt hair, seemed completely unaware of the world around her. Her mouth occasionally moved as if she were mumbling something in her dreams, her eyes tightly shut, and one hand still clutching the remote control, as though she were holding the key to her own world. No one could tell if she was dreaming of a relaxing evening or simply falling into a deep sleep after a long day. The police walked in, glanced at each other for a moment, and then turned back to the sleeping woman. One of the officers couldn't help but let out a soft chuckle. He shrugged and said, "Doesn't look like someone who's causing trouble, but I guess we're in for a long night." The officer's remark, half joking yet serious, seemed like a prediction of an upcoming confrontation that would be anything but simple. His voice, though light, carried an undertone of alertness, signaling that he was ready to handle whatever might come next. It was not just an observation, but a reminder that tonight might not unfold as quietly and peacefully as they had hoped. It felt as if the atmosphere itself was bracing for a storm. The woman, still lost in her sleep, had no idea that in that very moment her life was about to take a turn. While she remained quietly reclined on the sofa, the world around her had begun to shift. The bar owner, though accustomed to unexpected situations, felt uneasy this time, sensing something off about the woman's attitude. The police, too, could clearly see that this evening might not end in the quiet and calm they had expected. While they had dealt with their fair share of complicated situations, this one left them with an unfamiliar sense of uncertainty that couldn't be concealed. Things could escalate quickly from here, and the woman's resistance was something nobody could predict. The polite smiles and casual remarks from the police and the bar owner might not be enough to stop the events that were about to unfold. And while the atmosphere in the lounge remained eerily still, both sides understood that they were probably standing on the brink of an unavoidable battle. The woman, whose name we will call Autumn for now, sat quietly in a corner of the lounge, as if everything around her belonged to her. She showed no signs of embarrassment or hesitation. On the contrary, her demeanor exuded an unbelievable naturalness. Her disheveled hair had not been groomed in a while, with strands hanging loosely as though she had just woken up from a long nap. Her thick jacket was draped carelessly over her shoulders, left unbuttoned, as if she couldn't care less about what was happening around her. Her mismatched sneakers, one askew, the other lost amidst the chaos of the space she had claimed, only highlighted her indifference, a demeanor of fearlessness, of being unfazed by anything. Though she was not the only person in the lounge, Autumn radiated an unpredictable energy, as though the very space had been created solely for her. The surroundings, with their luxurious leather chairs, soft lighting, and soothing music, seemed to merely serve as a backdrop for her presence. Other customers, who had been enjoying the peaceful atmosphere, couldn't help but glance at her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. Each glance they shot her way carried a sense of suspicion and discontent, but no one dared approach or speak out, as if they feared that one wrong word might escalate the tension. The lounge, typically a place of enjoyment, had, in this moment, transformed into Autumn's personal stage, with all eyes on her, passively and helplessly. The police walked into the lounge, and the atmosphere inside was unusually quiet, with no loud chatter or laughter, as on most evenings. This time, only the dim yellow light reflected off the worn wooden tables. The two officers walked past each table, their eyes never leaving the woman stretched out on the sofa, hands clasped in anticipation. As they approached, one of them, with an unchanged expression, cleared his throat and quietly made his way toward the woman, trying not to startle her. "Excuse me, ma'am. We're the police. Could you tell us your name?" Autumn slowly opened her eyes, but not in the dazed manner one would expect after being abruptly woken up. She opened her eyes like someone waking from a deep sleep after a long day, everything around her suddenly blurry, as if she were the only person left in the space. She glanced at the officers before turning her attention back to the sofa as though only it could bring her comfort. With a long, exaggerated sigh, as if fed up with the uninteresting questions, she muttered, "Name? I don't really remember. Maybe I left it at my girlfriend's house yesterday." Her response made the first officer struggle to suppress a laugh, though he quickly regained his composure and tried to maintain a serious demeanor. However, the second officer remained stone-faced, and his next question carried an undeniable tone of seriousness. "Do you have ID? Can you help us verify your identity?" Autumn didn't rush to answer. Instead, she stretched out comfortably, yawning and stretching like she was waking up from a soft bed, not a cold lounge sofa. She shook her head slightly, her eyes half-hearted and uninterested. "I don't think so. What are you guys doing here anyway? This is my break time." Her voice was soft but laden with a challenge. She didn't seem at all concerned that she was facing two police officers, and her answer seemed to ignore everything going on around her. She simply believed that a good nap was the most important thing at that moment. The atmosphere in the lounge became oddly surreal as the quiet laughter of a customer at a distant table began to ring out. People started to pay attention, their gazes shifting to Autumn, who lay stretched out on the sofa as though it were her own living room. Despite the curious and somewhat annoyed looks from other patrons, she remained nonchalant, as if attending a private party, like an honored guest, completely indifferent to what was unfolding around her. At this point, the officers approached her with a gentle yet clearly serious tone. They tried to explain that refusing to provide information not only disrupted the investigation but could also lead to charges of resisting law enforcement. However, Autumn appeared unfazed. She responded casually, laced with sarcasm and humor, as though she had just come from a crash course in law school. Without an ounce of worry, she retorted in a way that surprised even the onlookers. "Resisting? I just don't want to wake up. This is a lounge, right? Lounges are for napping." Her statement didn't just reflect a lack of seriousness. It revealed a disdain for the rules the officers were trying to impose. Autumn seemed to be toying with the police's authority, not caring one bit that she was violating regulations or making the officers' jobs harder. She continued to exude an air of absolute nonchalance and freedom, which only made the atmosphere more tense and awkward. Autumn's words not only reflected laziness but also showcased a reasoned non-cooperation that was both unique and unsettling, leaving the officers in a state of confusion and discomfort. While the situation was clearly escalating, Autumn remained entirely indifferent, as if completely unaware of the gravity of the situation. She showed no signs of concern or regret. On the contrary, her expression suggested she was proud of her absolute freedom in her actions. When hearing the officer's question, the police officers couldn't help but exchange bewildered glances, trying to stifle their growing frustration. They realized they would have to change tactics if they hoped to resolve this without further incident. One officer, after taking a deep breath, decided to adopt a gentler approach, speaking in a tone one might use to address a crying child. With a forced smile, he said, "We just want to make sure you're okay. Do you have any identification?" His voice was soft, as if he feared his words might scare or anger her. Yet, Autumn remained sprawled out on the sofa, unmoved, as though the question had no relevance to her. She turned on her side, stretched again as if preparing to return to sleep, and mumbled indifferently, "ID. I'm not a library." Her reply was both funny and unexpected, leaving a strong impression of someone not only lazy but also determined not to cooperate with anyone. The response didn't just demonstrate a lack of respect for the officer's request. It reflected an attitude of defiance, as if Autumn were proud of breaking all the rules and causing trouble without fear. Her comment, a mix of humor and subtle mockery, quickly made the atmosphere increasingly tense in an ironically amusing way. It revealed that this young woman wasn't just deliberately resisting, she was cleverly playing with the officer's patience. Autumn's words, full of humor yet also sarcastic, seemed to challenge the seriousness of the law enforcement officers, as though she was avoiding responsibility while daring them to take action. The way she spoke, though somewhat naive, was entirely purposeful, making listeners feel both frustrated and bewildered by her shrewdness. A moment of silence passed, making the atmosphere heavier than before. The officers, though used to handling various situations, seemed unsure of how to proceed next. They realized that this was no ordinary case. Autumn's innocent wisdom had thrown them off, and they were now unsure how to deal with her. She wasn't just resisting, she was acting as though she were performing in a comedy with high drama. The officers' faces showed visible discomfort, as they realized they were not only dealing with a violator but also an unexpected performance they hadn't prepared for. From that quiet moment, the situation suddenly shifted from a normal conversation to a fierce struggle. When the officers decided to detain her to verify her identity, they were completely unprepared for what Autumn was about to do. Still lying on the sofa as if nothing important was happening, she suddenly sprang up with agility and flair, like a circus performer executing a daring escape trick. Her eyes wide open, her posture defensive, she raised her hands as if to fight off an invisible army. "Don't touch me! I just need to use the bathroom. What's the problem?" Autumn's calm but pointed remark not only caught the officers off guard, but also made everyone in the room stifle a laugh. They couldn't figure out whether she was genuinely concerned about using the bathroom or just playing a diversionary game to prolong her defiance. The tension from before had now morphed into a bizarre mix of seriousness and humor that no one could resist. Before the officers could respond, she began running around the sofa, her arms flailing as though she was directing a feng shui rehearsal. With each step, she muttered something incomprehensible, then suddenly stopped, shouting loudly, which silenced the room. "I'm not sitting down. This chair doesn't have good feng shui." One officer attempted to approach her, but Autumn immediately leapt to the other side of the couch, spinning around like a cat playing a game of chase. Seeing this, the officer sighed and whispered to his colleague, "Are we police officers or psychological experts here?" Autumn didn't miss the opportunity, continuing her dramatic performance, pointing at the corner of the room. "If you really care about me, move that chair. The energy here is all wrong." Her mixture of firm demands and bizarre requests left the officers confused and helpless. One officer, seemingly used to such uncomfortable situations, smirked. "I guess tonight we'll learn something new about feng shui." Autumn, realizing she was in control, crossed her arms and leaned back on the sofa, her eyes sparkling with pride as if she had just won a battle. Things began to heat up when Autumn, who had been verbally resisting, suddenly switched to physical resistance. She kicked, waved her arms, and scratched at the officers like a free-for-all fighter. The officers tried to calm her down with words, but her actions became bolder by the second. One officer, dodging a kick, whispered to his colleague sarcastically, "Maybe she thinks this is an MMA tryout." Meanwhile, Autumn, sensing that she was in charge of the situation, began turning the struggle into an unfortunate negotiation. She stopped flailing for a few seconds, stared at the officer in front of her, and made a bizarre request. "If you buy me a bubble tea, I'll tell you my name." One of the officers, taken aback by the strange offer, chuckled but quickly regained his composure. "Ma'am, this is not a bubble tea shop. And we don't accept bribes, especially not in drink form." Undeterred, Autumn continued her attack with a swift kick into the air, aimed at the shoes of one officer. "You don't get it. Bubble tea is all I need to calm down." The struggle escalated as another officer was scratched on the arm and had to retreat. The police team realized that, given the level of resistance, they needed reinforcements. A call was made for backup while Autumn continued her vigorous movements, occasionally shouting, "Don't touch me! I just want bubble tea. What's wrong with that?" Despite their best efforts to remain professional, the officers couldn't hide their discomfort. One officer looked at his teammate with a helpless expression. "This is probably the weirdest arrest of my career." Finally, after a series of struggles and failed attempts to reason with her, Autumn was handcuffed and moved to a safer position. However, her defiance didn't diminish. Instead, she began to employ a new tactic that was both humorous and unbelievable. She threw herself on the ground and began banging her head against the floor dramatically, like an actor preparing for an emotional scene. She yelled with a trembling voice, as though she were a victim of a great injustice. "You're bullying me. I just want to use the bathroom. Why are you doing this to me?" One officer, who had witnessed countless complex and sometimes violent incidents, stared at her with a mixture of confusion and exhaustion. He sighed, then shook his head as if all his patience had been drained, speaking bitterly. "I've encountered many tough situations, but honestly, she deserves to be the champion of them all. I don't think I'll meet someone like this again in my life." It was in this moment that these officers realized that not every situation could be solved with reason or gentle intervention. Despite being restrained, Autumn refused to give up her battle. She kept finding ways to stir up trouble, creating bizarre performances and drawing attention. Yet, beneath all these actions was a woman experiencing a sense of powerlessness, trapped in a situation she had created for herself. The act of banging her head on the floor, though seemingly irrational, was a form of subtle resistance, reflecting her frustration and impatience with being forced to comply with demands she didn't want to follow. All she wanted was simple: to use the bathroom, a seemingly harmless request, but one that had become part of a larger battle she had constructed in her mind. What she saw as injustice, the officers saw as an unnecessary struggle with no way out. The police didn't have the luxury of diving deep into her reasons or emotions. They had to continue with their work, facing off with a champion of resistance. When Autumn was finally forced into the police car, she had no intention of surrendering easily. Instead of giving in, she continued using every possible tactic to resist. She yanked, squirmed like a fish caught on a hook, flailing her limbs wildly while complaining loudly. "Don't grab my shoulders like that. You're wrinkling my shirt." The officers, perhaps accustomed to tense situations, tried to stabilize her, but they were surprised to find that Autumn considered this simple act an outrageous violation of her fashion sense. As one officer tried to twist her arm to prevent her from biting him, Autumn kept murmuring complaints. "I'm not a doll. Don't treat me like one." But her reactions only complicated the situation further. She kept squirming, trying to kick the officers, each time forcing them to adjust their hold on her to prevent hurting her. One officer looked at his colleagues, sighed, and said, "Does she seriously not understand what situation she's in?" But patience can only last so long. The officers had to change their tactics, moving from a standard hold to a stricter method to ensure no more moves were made. Meanwhile, Autumn continued to struggle, her eyes full of defiance. "Is this what you call fair? Take me to jail. At least I won't have to deal with this bad treatment." One officer subtly smirked, seemingly out of patience, but still trying to keep his calm. "Can you stop crying and cooperate? Nobody wants to be here, but if you keep this up, no one will be able to handle it." After a prolonged struggle, Autumn finally relented, though her anger had not cooled. She continued to mutter under her breath, deliberately ignoring the officers' requests. They, however, did not back down, persistently carrying out their duties despite her constant fashion and sports challenges. Finally, after a chaotic struggle, Autumn was charged with trespassing, resisting arrest, and assaulting officers during the arrest. As the patrol car rolled away, everything had calmed down, but not without leaving traces of exhaustion on the officers' faces. One of them, who had spent the entire night trying to keep her under control, sat down on the side of the road, breathing a sigh of relief. He rested his head in his hands, closing his eyes for a rare moment of peace, then muttered, "I think I need a long vacation after tonight's shift." His words were a quiet acknowledgment of the unavoidable tension and exhaustion in their job when faced with situations that seemed to never end. From the back seat of the patrol car, Autumn, still handcuffed and forced into silence, still couldn't pass up the opportunity to deliver one last sarcastic remark. She turned her head towards the officers, flashed them an inscrutable smile, and said in a mocking tone full of self-importance, "Make sure to lock up that lounge before you leave, all right?" Her words, light but filled with defiance, were a final jab aimed at the officers who had spent so much time and energy restraining her. It seemed Autumn still didn't realize that her stubbornness and attitude had led her to this situation, viewing it as just another part of the game where she was still the winner. Although the situation had ended, Autumn's final words left a lasting impression, as if reaffirming that not all rules and authority could control everything.